You're listening to Tiger and the Viper. Garbage duty. It's Tuesday, and it's so hot by mid-morning that most people have wisely drank themselves into a stupor the night before, so they could sleep through the heat until afternoon. Heat like this tended to sap the soul right out of you, so no one tried to do anything at all if they had the choice. I didn't have the choice. I was lacing up my boots when the knock came at my door. When I slid it open, I saw Daedalus' silver dreads pulled back into a bun. Her faded blue eyes danced in the half-dark like a mote of dust in the shaft of light. "Glad I caught you," she said. I laughed. "I heard Abe was looking for you," I said, braiding my hair into a pleat so I could pin it back before the workday. "You found me," Daedalus smiled, folding away any other information as she leaned against the doorframe. "Where are you headed?" "Tuesday garbage duty." "Grab your sun goggles, head downstairs with me," Daedalus said with a calm tilt of her head. I have duty though," I said, folding my gloves into my pocket. Daedalus was being more cryptic than she normally was, especially since it didn't seem like she and Nate were completely in step recently. "Not anymore," Daedalus said, waving a folded clutch of papers from her overall pocket. "We received your medical leniency request, so we're reassigning you as of today." I swallowed the ruefulness off my face. Those went in months ago. I nodded instead. "But I'm grateful for whatever accommodations you have." "That's the spirit. Sadly, we haven't cracked the code of bureaucracy just yet," Daedalus said with a touch of regret in her voice. She slid the papers back into her overalls. "That being said, I hope you know how to drive. You marked it off on the application." I shrugged, thinking back to how dusty my experience really was, especially since the label had always insisted on driving me around in a van, handler in tow. "Good enough to get by," I said, lying through my teeth. If performing had taught me one thing, it was that there was always a spot that needed to be filled, and most things could be taught by doing. "Good," Daedalus nodded, taking me in completely, as if for the first time. I held my breath, almost afraid of what she'd see if she looked for too long. "Let's head out." "Where exactly are we headed to?" I asked. "Facility about 20 clicks west of here," Daedalus said, stopping herself when she saw a blank look in my eye. "I'm sorry. I keep forgetting you're not 8. It's less than half a mile drive away," she said after a moment. I noticed that in a lot of ways she was a worn-in leader, the way most elder matriarchs were, tired but always teaching. She was able to pull apart information and reconfigure it into a different arrangement of words so it could be better understood, like grabbing a Rubik's Cube and reshuffling the tiles. As someone who didn't get it right even half the time unless I'd been coached, I was impressed. I grabbed my sun goggles like she'd asked and sneaked a look over at Daedalus, wondering why she wasn't taking Aid along. From the few months I'd been here, it was clear to me that he wasn't a chauffeur by any means, but he came and went often with Daedalus off the mountain into the outlying ghost towns, Nyland and Estelle. Not bringing him this time seemed odd. We made our way through the maze of technicolor flickering hallways in Salvation, heading down to the garage. Wending through the tight passageways with Daedalus was a surreal experience, because usually I had my favorite paths that cut through the quieter passageways. But heading down together, I watched as Daedalus swept down a dizzying amount of switchbacks and shortcuts I'd never noticed before in my wanderings. People recognized her. She had an easy greeting for all of them, a handshake and a soft clipped smile. Watching her, I wasn't able to pick apart how she did it, only a year or so away from being on the stage myself. I couldn't remember what it was like to have all the attention pinpointed at me like a laser on myself anymore. When I thought back to the feeling, all it did was make me tired. And for once, all the attention was on Daedalus. I got to slide into the woodwork as I watched her work. It was going to take us twice as long to get down to the garage, but in some ways, I was fascinated by Daedalus. She wasn't a politician in any sense of the word, and definitely wasn't busying herself with kissing any babies or making any far-flung promises to the slappers. Instead, she inspected the parts of the passageways that needed repairs and listened with interest when a man with scratched glasses explained to her that we needed to get our hands on pigs for the growing numbers of people. I looked between Daedalus and the man. "For bacon or what? Wouldn't it be too costly to take care of animals here, especially pigs?" He shook his head gently as Daedalus smiled her cryptic smile. "Not necessarily for food. We do technically already have animals here. We keep bees. We need the pigs for insulin." My eyebrows furrowed, remembering that as far back as a child, I learned something similar in school about 21st century medicine. "Not everyone at Salvation is able to live without help," Daedalus said, looking at the tight clod of snaking passageways, with its patchwork of wires, building materials, and tattered decorations. The children that ducked around the corridors, all covered in red desert dust. I thought about my ACA inhibitors sitting upstairs growing thin in their pill bottle every day with a growing dread. I was off all my other meds for months after running out, and I hadn't seen a doctor. There was no real way of knowing what was going on inside my body, or how much time I really had. I didn't want to think about the fact that other people were in my situation too. I nodded silently, a solemn gloom settling over me. How many people like me had chosen to make the same trek across the desert? And how many of us would survive this first brutal summer? Daedalus nodded her goodbyes to the man with the scratched glasses, and we continued to make our way through the mountain. As we did, the people's concerns began to collect like rainwater in a bucket. The heat towards the top of the mountain was going to become unbearable by July if nothing was going to cool it down. Water delivery was broken again in the East Ward, an electrical fire in the South End. By the time we reached the cool, uncramped depths of the garage, I was sweating and my head was spinning. Life was precarious here in Salvation, and after getting a real idea of everyone else's lives, it began to dawn on me that we were all doing a crazy thing here, leaving a city with infrastructure and order to build everything from scratch here in the middle of a desert. The thought made my stomach hurt. How were we going to do that with this many people and this many variables? "How are you doing?" Daedalus asked as we walked towards her dune buggy. She hadn't even broken a sweat from the trek. I stepped up on the oversized tires and used the exposed rail of the buggy to pull myself into the driver's seat. I thought about her question for a moment. "That's a lot of FaceTime every day," I said simply after a moment. "I'd be exhausted." "I am exhausted," Daedalus admitted, laughing. I looked at her in surprise. "You wear it well, I wouldn't have known." Daedalus climbed into the buggy's passenger seat and belted herself down. People have a lot of needs and require a lot of resources in a functioning society. Having someone who's really able to listen is one of them. "Doesn't it get overwhelming when you can't make everyone happy, though?" I asked, staring off into the dead dashboard in front of me. The key was jammed into the ignition, but not yet turned. Daedalus pulled a bandana around her neck for the ride, making 2 neat knots behind her head. "That's an entertainer question, I think," she said, teasing. I laughed, caught off guard by her read. "What do you mean?" She gave me an ironic smile. Entertainers are tasked with something unfair, I've always thought. They are asked to make us happy, and that's such a fleeting thing to provide to people, you might as well be doing alchemy. She looked down at her wrinkled, calloused hands. Public servants are different. We have to take people's needs and turn them into something realistic so we can all keep going. We're not ultimately worried about happiness. We worry about the health of the whole, because that's the only way things get done. "So, you're not worried if the people of Salvation are happy?" I asked, intrigued. "Hell no," Daedalus chuckled. "Personally? Sure. Professionally? Absolutely not. That's their job." I shook my head in disbelief. Daedalus looked at me for a moment before continuing. "Happiness is best left to the people. I work on making sure that they feel safe, fed, and dignified, so they can focus on being happy." I chewed over her last comment as I flipped on the ignition. "All of that takes a lot of work. Definitely not something for the faint of heart," I said, only half joking. "It's a good thing that we're not," she said simply, giving me an amused smile. The reddish-gray dust of the desert made it feel like we were driving on the surface of Mars. Everything as far as the eye could see felt blanched and roasted by the sun. The sun goggles only helped with a portion of that. Not many people I knew had been this deep into the Inland Empire. There honestly wasn't much of an empire left after the colossal flooding had washed away whatever farmland was still holding out years ago. Now most of it was a dry expanse as far as the eye could see, and empty towns that dotted the landscape. 50-year-old buildings that had been abandoned after the mass exodus to Malibu. Funny how so many people had ended up back out here. I wonder if Salvation would ever grow big enough to overtake these ghost towns. But if they'd managed to make use of the boring tunnels, there wasn't much stopping the slabbers, honestly. The buggy rolled over the pitted remnants of asphalt and shifting sands easily with its fat tires, but the constant motion was starting to get me queasy. "How much longer?" I called over to Daedalus. "Take a right at the next T intersection," she responded, not quite answering my question. I swallowed my nausea and my annoyance and kept my eyes alert for the intersection. After about a few silent moments, we reached the T in the road. I turned our buggy right, and we drove until we saw an empty ramp for an old California highway called the 111. The sign was faded and shot halfway to hell by what I assumed were the dune rats. Just to be safe, I made a cautious sweep of the horizon to make sure I didn't see anyone else. We rolled into the destroyed 111, nothing but desiccated palm trees and ripped up asphalt ahead of us. It didn't take long for us to reach the outskirts of an island, and for the jagged outline of gutted buildings and the shells of old cars to start sliding by. The only things that had seemed to outlive the people of Nyland was their metal signage. The Oasis RV park, with its empty, crumbling pool, was now home to tumbleweeds and desert animals. The far painted wall of the Buckshot Diner was the only surviving part of the building, and it sat facing the highway with its peeling paint, looking like it maybe had once been painted a sort of dark forest green. Further into the town, across from the old school, sat a waving road that seemed to abruptly stop, giving way to a huge unfenced wilderness dotted sparsely with petrified squat palm trees and burned shrubs. I stopped the buggy for a moment, staring off into the dust. "That used to be a small wildlife habitat," Daedalus said in an offhand manner. "We used to have lily ponds, goats, lots of migratory birds on their way to the Salton Sea. It was a beautiful place once." "What happened?" I asked. "Brush fire jumped the highway, swept through most of the town, the ranch included," she said, eyes looking out distantly onto the burned landscape. "They didn't have the type of technology we do now to stop fires. But it makes you think about the fireproofing for a place like Salvation for sure." I looked around at the decimated town and felt my heart do a small flip-flop in my chest. It was hard to know for sure if it was out of empathy, stress, or just running out of meds. I just knew I wanted to get out of this town sooner rather than later. I snapped the motor back on and continued down the 111, past the long stretches of dead farmland and now silent telephone wires. After a few more minutes of driving, Daedalus told me to stop. I peered past the cage of the dune buggy at the unremarkable intersection and the highway bifurcated by a long, flat dirt road. "Here?" I asked. "Yes, you'll want to hang a left," she said. I steered down the road warily. It didn't seem like this road went anywhere besides it deep into the desert, nothing. The last place we wanted to be without a backup. I looked back at Daedalus. "Care to tell me where the hell we're going?" I asked, wondering if this was some sort of test. "Sure." Daedalus took a moment to comb the sand and dust out of her hair with her fingers. "We're going to our lithium plant." I looked at her, dumbfounded. "Our what?" "We have a lithium processing center out here, a few of them. They were already built and abandoned by the time we got here." "So you're telling me we're running off lithium-ion batteries at Salvation?" I asked, shaking my head. "Close. We're running off of solar and lithium," she responded. "We've got no shortage of sun out here. We use lithium batteries in our generators to store it. Without the brine pools out here, though, in the Salton Sea, Salvation wouldn't be running." "Pools? There's still water out here? I thought the name was just a holdover." "It's saltier than the Dead Sea and shrinking by the day, but there's still water," Daedalus smiled. "You'll see soon enough." The flat, packed dirt road rolled into a wasteland for miles. Except the deeper we drove, the sides of that road began to cut away, dropping below the road line. Inside the troughs, I saw the reflection of murky, algae-green water. We passed another dilapidated sign, this time in a faded, peeling brown, that read, Sunny Bono Wildlife National Refuge. The name made me smile. I didn't have the first clue who Sunny Bono was, but I wondered if my namesake had any wildlife left in her refuge. As we made our way down the road, I began to see stacks of smoke peel themselves away from the piercing blue of the cloudless desert sky. A bone-white facility began to make itself clear across the landscape, like the carcass of some giant animal. Its line of bell-shaped cooling towers came into clear view first, like small lined-up versions of a nuclear power plants. Next, after those were the conical structures with their rusted bellies out in the sun. It looked like a completely abandoned facility, if not for the smoke pouring from the chimneys and the rows of sleek, shiny black cars outside lined up like beetles. I gestured my chin toward the cars. "Are we meeting anyone?" Daedalus's arm was so quick on my forearm that I barely saw her move. "Pull off the road," she said, eyes fixed on the cars. "Right now." Thanks for listening. If you like the story so far, or you're just a big fan of indie sci-fi and you want to help support what we do, please consider joining us on Patreon. You can find the project details, listen to bloopers, and get the episodes 2 days early as a patron, along with high-resolution chapter art, character sketches, and bonus content. To sign up, head to patreon.com/yeyankee.